in the way. What he says we will do, where he sends we will go. Not only trust and obey, trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. I'm also doing this morning mission report, and I would like to cover a lot of territory. I'm going to go back to early 1900s. And the reason I'm doing this, I'm thinking of how God protects his children and how he blesses us. And how he's done that, of course, throughout this world, but we often don't even realize living in this, shall I say, Western type of a world, what goes on in other places. And I'm going to back up and talk a little bit about my father. My father was taken to Russia when he was barely born. And in those days, Christians were being persecuted. The Turks and the Kurds and all of these would give Christians a bad time, so they would run. And in this case, my grandparents ran across the border from Iran to Russia, where my dad grew up and became a minister. So 20-some years later, he became an Adventist with a lot of difficulty because his parents were Greek Orthodox, and they did not think that being an Adventist is the way to go. They wanted him to be a Greek Orthodox, and they tried every way possible to stop him, but they didn't succeed. Eventually, he became pastor, and he was a pastor of the Ukraine church. Of all the places nowadays, we think about Ukraine, and we think how things are there which are awful. This was, of course, in Kiev, where he was pastoring a church. And so many years went by, and communism, of course, started coming in 1917, and things became worse and worse and worse. And in 1920s and further, a lot of our ministers were being sent to Siberia. The communism did not like Christianity, so as a result, a lot of Adventist ministers suffered. Now, my father had an opportunity to go back to Iran because he was born in Iran and taken to Russia, so they told him, okay, you can go. Well, he did come to Iran and started another Russian congregation. Now, in the Middle East in those years, there were a lot of different nationalities. And some of these nationalities were so anxious to have something of their own going. Often they had clubs and so forth. But Russians had a small congregation. This congregation grew larger and larger. And so my father was pastoring this church, and Russians had hospitals that they built in the parts of Middle East. They had a beautiful one in Iran. And of course, all the Russian employees heard rumors that there's a Russian church and there's a Russian pastor. So in a short time, our congregation grew with a lot of visitors. These are employees working for Soviet hospitals. And of course, in time, he baptized quite a few. And I'm going to shorten this and bring it to the end where the communists became very unhappy because they didn't like their employees to become Adventists and so forth. And so in time, our missionaries came flowing into the Middle East through the, I'd say, 50s, maybe earlier, 45 to 50. And as they came in there, our Adventist church had a very close connection to the government, and two, also a lot of the employees that came from the Soviet hospitals uh, were pretty well happy, and the congregation was doing real well until somehow the missionaries came, and with the contact with the American embassies and so forth, they found out that the Russians are very unhappy, and they're going to do something to this pastor who's bringing people into his church. And so, to make the story short, uh, in time, my father had no choice but leave to the United States. Otherwise, KGB was on his tail and all of that thing. That gets very involved. Towards the end, an ophthalmologist who was working for the Russian hospital came and asked to be baptized. He had been craving, he said, for religion all these years. And here's a chance. He decided that he would want to learn more about Bible. So in very short time, we provided him with Bibles and so forth. And eventually, excuse me, eventually the conference told my dad, you better be careful because KGB is going to be very unhappy with this. And so I was about 7 or 8 years at the time old, and my dad asked me to go to this doctor's house and bring all this religious material to our place, because if KGB would find out, he'd be in trouble. So I went with this doctor, and he loaded a car full of material, it was Bibles and other things, religious material. So on the way to our house, the taxi driver told me, he said, hey, we're being followed by KGB. And I thought to myself, wow, this wasn't supposed to happen, but it was happening. So as we arrived to my destination where we were supposed to unload all these materials, the KGB came, grabbed him, and dragged him away. And I ran to the house immediately, and we never heard any more from him. But I will say this man had determined that it was time for him to serve the Lord. And he was baptized, and he was ready, but we don't know how things ended up. But as I think about all of the blessings that the Lord provides his people, my dad was blessed to become an Adventist minister. He was blessed to be allowed to go to Iran. He was blessed again to start another congregation. And the Lord provided all of the needs that we have if we seek him. And if we take the time to walk with him, he provides everything that we need. And as I think about experiences my father had and all the miracles that I've seen take place during his ministry, we went through war. This was the end of Second World War. We had to escape from the city to the forest and all that. And eventually there was a horrible earthquake which caused major, major devastation. The whole town was wiped out after one shock after another. Eventually it was all destroyed. And when you go through all this through your life, and you go through a little war, you go through earthquakes, and you see all these miracles, how people come to the Lord, and how wonderful it is for us today to talk about Christ to our friends, to our neighbors, and so forth. And that's what this moment is about, what I'm doing right now. We need to tell all about God's love to everybody that we can. And sometimes we shy away. We don't want to take time to come up here and talk about the things that you've experienced. Unfortunately, that's the opportunity for us to talk about love of God. And the love of God is so great that in spite of our circumstances, whatever we might be doing, it will come through and God will take care of us. Thank you. Now, let's go to